I think asceticism is a concomitant of Eros. So if you have a high place for Eros in your culture or in your worldview or your theological system, then asceticism follows on. Certainly when we hand ourselves over to Berserk mode, what we're aiming for is a total weaponization of the self in the interest of survival or vengeance or to prevail in this encounter. I knew people who were saints. You can't talk me out of that. Christianity as an ideology fighting other ideologies has a certain utility, and I think it answers real questions people have, and that's great. But I think for a lot of people, it really will come down to, have they met a saint or not? Like, you encounter beauty in a holy person in such a way, and I'm not escaping this. I'm trapped now. I'm in the net. This is reality. It has called my name. This is where we're going.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Agape podcast. It's a pleasure to have you listening here once again. Today, I have a new guest, Timothy Patitsas, and he wrote this wonderful book called The Ethics of Beauty. And you can see that I did enjoy it. And so, we're going to talk a little bit about the book, talk a little bit about beauty. And I'm super excited for it. So, Timothy, thank you so much for coming.
Tiago, it's so great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So just quickly before we start, just please introduce yourself for like a couple minutes and just tell us a little bit about yourself and a little about your work, and then we'll dive right in.
My name is Timothy Patitsas. I was born and raised in Northeast Ohio, going to public schools. After my university career had different twists and turns, I ended up doing a doctorate in systematic theology and then being hired back at the seminary where I had studied to teach ethics and social ethics and bioethics. So I teach, the ethical tradition of the Greek Orthodox Church, but I also do a lot of pilgrimage, and I really try to seek out people who are considered to be, for lack of a better term, sort of living saints. And my interest in them is personal and spiritual, but it's also very analytic. Like I like being alongside them and thinking about how they seem to be seeing the world, what it feels like to be them, what is their mode of thought and being. So that's like a kind of a research interest. And then, like all academics, I think I'm a pampered, subsidized person. I teach, I read, I write a little bit, and society is asking me to think deeply about it all. And hopefully, to some extent, I'm worth the paycheck.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, and most definitely worth it. So I was thinking a really good place to start could be kind of your experience of Greek culture. That's something that kind of stood out to me right away. I thought that was quite interesting. Number one, because of kind of like some of the angle that you took of just kind of like the way that they're different from the culture of the US and US/the West in general. I found that quite interesting. But also, how they preserved kind of this aspect of sacredness that has been like increasingly lost a little bit. Also, obviously, I do know that you kind of have this multicultural vision, let's say, that you then kind of advocate later on. Maybe we'll get into that. But I found the Greek one especially appealing to me. And I was also quite amazed by the fact that it was just kind of like based on your personal experience. Like you're not just someone just idealizing or fantasizing about Greek culture from the outside, but it's something that you actually have a little bit of experience with. So yeah, it'd be wonderful to maybe so that you can expand a little bit on both your personal experience and like what do you think that Greek culture has to offer within obviously the realm and the subject of beauty.
Yeah, that's a good question. That's my father was an immigrant from Greece to the United States, and so was my mother's father. In fact, he was an illegal immigrant who was naturalized under the Truman amnesty. But he'd already been here 30 years and raised a whole family and was a successful business owner. In those days, you could do a lot more, off the books of your life. And then my mother's mother was an immigrant from Germany, so I was always very aware of the home cultures because they were just right, you know, just so close. And then, I mean, this was true of early German immigration, like in the 1820s through 1850s, that they really were concerned to preserve the German language in the United States, and they thought the vehicle for that would be church life, Roman Catholic church life, and that didn't persist, that didn't succeed. But certainly when I grew up in the 1970s and 80s, the Greek communities were still insisting that all the children went to Greek school on Saturday and try to learn Greek, and it wasn't necessarily the greatest skill about how to convey the language, but there was a lot of shame for not speaking it, and so that that stayed with me as an aspiration to understand that the culture of my father and of my mother's father and try to assimilate to it. I also ended up learning German. I just think it was just kind of an honor of parents, honor for parents. So then started more and more trips back to the home country, and that became more and more part of my life. But my identity really is it remains American. I mean, America is a kind of big imaginative tableau in which you can project a lot of things. Um, so the romance of the West and just the whole Anglo-American tradition, all that's extremely appealing to me. But I guess the final thing I would say, because I don't want to drag on, but we went to church every Sunday, to a Greek Orthodox church. We went to Greek school every Saturday, during the school year. We were at church maybe twice more a week during Lent every year. We would go for all of Holy Week, like every night. My mother taught the Greek dance troupe, so I had to be a member of that, and then as I got older, a leading member of it. So culturally, it doesn't feel as stark now, at my age, but as a child, it felt like a big deal. Like, here's my American life, and then there's this other Greek world that I constantly have access to.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's very interesting. And so what do you think that you got the most out of that exposition of the Greek culture compared to maybe some of your peers that were just like normal Americans without any ties to Greek culture at all? What do you think you got from it?
Probably a greater love for America than they have. You don't really know, you don't sort of know something except through contrast. I mean, that has to be at least part of the process by which you learn something, is by seeing what it's not. So I think any child who grows up in two cultures just might have a greater appreciation and awareness of what cultural difference is, or how much of their life, how much of their mind is culturally predisposed. And I have a joke about this where, for 15 years I ran our school study abroad in Greece and Constantinople, and then I would go visit family in Germany, or my spiritual father in Moscow, and 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 I could see myself becoming a slightly different person with trying to speak each language and trying to be there. So I'm just a lot more precise in German, and I'm a lot more a lot. I have much higher self-esteem in Greece. There, um, in Russia, there's just a wild freedom that you kind of take on, and I think to some extent, I mean, maybe it's a downside of America. What my joke is, because it's true, is every year on the flight back, I would think, this year, I ought to buy a gun. It's I think America really is in many ways a Scots-Irish country, and it has that pugnacious culture to it. I mean, it has that edge. So that's the first thing, is but more deeply, because I was going to a Greek Orthodox church and standing in the liturgy for an hour or two, or longer, and during Holy Week, you learn that liturgical mode of being, which is not really it's not really a verbal culture, even though there's always words being said. It's much more a visual culture. It's a music culture, and then it's just that whole rhythm of liturgical being and understanding, knowing as participation. That's the biggest thing. That you realize that we've rediscovered this with the so-called 10,000-hour rule. You know something as you become it, as you participate in it. Book knowledge is a kind of a chess game, or as I say in the book, it's like you create your robot, I create my robot. Those are our two arguments, and we unleash them in the arena to see who will win. But liturgical knowing is in some other mode.
Yeah, wonderful. That's very, very insightful. So you mentioned liturgy, and that's actually one of the things that I wanted to speak about from a very specific angle, which is a lot of what I try to do with my own work and with this podcast as well, is that I do try to articulate and present a religious vision, a religious cosmology, but also at the same time do that a little bit through more secular terms, because I feel like, because I come from a completely secular, atheist, materialist background, and I felt that was quite harmful for my life and my spirituality and everything, really. And so a lot of what I'm trying to do is often, okay, how could I convince my younger self, when I was 16, 18, how would I bridge that gap so it wouldn't take me, 5-10 years to figure it out? But it's quite difficult to kind of make that translation because a lot gets lost in the process. And one of the things that kept appearing in my head as I was reading your book, particularly in terms of the topic of liturgy, is that kind of approach is especially unintelligible to like the secular person. Like, people have basically no idea what that is even, and even if you tell them, that like they don't really understand it. So I'm curious of, number one, how you describe liturgy to like a complete open-minded atheist. Like, what exactly is going on? And then obviously then you make these like very, very beautiful and very interesting then connections of kind of complex systems and cities and whatnot, and then you make the connection to liturgy. And I'm curious if you can then kind of like make then the explicit connection between what goes on in liturgy from like a secular perspective, let's say, but then also connect that to then complexity theory and like urban planning, let's call it like that, and a lot of the examples that you give, but while being very specific. Because one of the things that even though I really enjoyed a lot of what you said, I do feel like a lot of the times the arguments were a little bit like general in terms of like the dynamics that occur, right? And so which is very helpful, but it might be a little bit too abstract for people, I think, especially if they're not familiar with any of this.
Oh, I see what you mean by general for the non-initiate. I really am speaking to myself in a way. I mean, I think if I were talking to a 16-year-old boy, the issue would be, what rituals might I introduce him to without telling him that they're rituals? Like, it could be the changing of an honor guard, or the performance of a precision drill team of soldiers, let's say. It might be the running of the bulls and the things that go on around that, let's say in Pamplona or something. Just finding some living mass ritual where thousands of people are joyfully, willingly participating in it, and then taking them by the hand and let's just step into this. If that were my nephew, let's say, right? And I would let's just do a bunch of these. And I think that that tourism is going to go in this direction. Like my whole life, tourism has been about, do you want to see the pyramids? Do you want to see, the Vatican? Do you want to see this thing? And that really misses the point. The issue is you want to go to places at their ritual peak, at their liturgical peak, right? Kavala in Greece, northeastern Greece, is a great town. But if you go for the Vespers of Saints Peter and Paul, and the entire city gathers at the church, we say up on the hill, but it's really not that far up, within the city, higher up, and processes down to the spot on the Aegean where St. Paul first set foot in Europe, that's an out-of-body experience. So people can start to realize that, the meat of life is not in the physical things, but it's in processes. It's in patterns, the patterns of events that keep happening. So I get this really from Christopher Alexander. I'm really a disciple of him, and I didn't know him, but I sort of knew him through someone. One of my articles was published on his website before he died, at his approval. So I had some kind of glancing, but he's about, it's the pattern of things that keep happening that give a place its character. And then on a more secular side, Roy Rappaport, the great anthropologist, Rappaport, his book, Ritual and Religion in the Making of Humanity, he's writing in the 1990s, but he's summarizing 40 years or more of anthropological consensus that ritual is the foundational social act of humanity. And so these guys the anthropologists are entirely secular. They're not cheating. There's not some theological agenda. They're just showing you that this is the way it is. Yeah, but maybe that's not quite specific enough. I mean, every organization needs some predictability and some change in order to have a life. Like we need to, we're showing up on Tuesdays at the same time, and whatever we do after that, we do. But there has to be some conversation some rhythm between predictability and change. And that is an essential aspect of ritual. And anything that does that has some somewhat ritual character. How you wake up in the morning can determine your day. So get it right. Think about that ritual and get it right. And that's another thing with a 16-year-old boy, is just teaching them that, doing the right thing, consistently, small things correct consistently, that's going to get you to your goals. So again, that's an entree into ritual, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. That's very helpful. The other thing I would say though is that, like, even though I do think that ritual is super important, and I definitely agree with kind of the perspective that you took, I think also another aspect is also to actually show some of the reasoning behind the actual rituals that you're doing. So, for example, because I think that's a gateway to people to understand that the religiosity of the religious rituals, like they have a point. Like they're certainly not random. They're not tradition for tradition's sake. And so that's one of the things that I was trying to get at as well, with kind of the example of liturgy. So, for example, if maybe let's say you had this hypothetical nephew, you go to this like secular ritual and whatnot, and he kind of like gets it to some degree, but then, for example, how would you then bridge that to a religious context, in the sense that maybe he would just tell you, okay, sure, I kind of get this importance of like the dynamics of novelty and stability and kind of this aspect of community and so on, but I don't want to have anything to do with religion. I just don't get it. Why is the liturgy specific? Why is that any different than all these dynamics in secular rituals?
The religious rituals are more stable because the force that they're encountering is infinitely more wild. So if you know, you need some stability to handle just the chaos of your life. Like how are you organizing your week? How are you organizing anything? But when you encounter God or encounter Christ, this is an infinite force. For that encounter not to become overwhelming, destructive, we have, you know, quite a bit of stability, just, you know, quite a bit of structure around that. Right? It's a little bit like saying it's one thing to have your rituals around not forgetting your keys and your wallet when you leave the house in the morning. It's an entirely another thing, the level of ritual that sustains the safe operation of a nuclear power plant. I mean, this is going to be, you know, to an incredible degree, and you know that we've studied this. You know, I think they call them like HROs, like high reliability organizations. That was an old term for it in the sociological analysis. Organizations that just never fail, and it isn't only, you know, routine. It's other things. There's a tripartite structure that keeps an American supercarrier at sea able to launch planes in all kinds of weather, you know, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for infinity. The nuclear reactors, everything. So that tripartite structure is an irreducible, you know, irreducible thing, and people gravitate to different parts of that structure. So yeah, I think it was it was either in the 70s or 80s, and I have the article somewhere on my laptop, but I think it was 3 sociologists who spent 6 months on an aircraft carrier trying to answer this question. Look, you cannot have a 1% failure rate on an aircraft carrier. That would be catastrophic. You know, you can't have 1/1000th. You've really just gotta get it down to almost 0. So how do you do that? And they found that there were 3 systems of order simultaneously operating, and the first is what we think of as military, just a traditional chain of command. You know, the president tells the admiral, tells the captain, tells the crew, and they execute. And an additional form of orders, you know, form of order and structure was what happens if there is a fire or a spill or a bomb goes rolling on the deck or whatever. And in those cases, there's no time to give commands. You just have to drill for disaster and catastrophe and know what you're supposed to do when the catastrophe happens. So when it happens, you just do it. There's really no one in charge. And then the third source of order was the one that was surprising to them and they hadn't anticipated. And that was that on the flight deck itself, that expertise outweighed rank. And they called this the rule of the tech sergeants. So a tech sergeant in rank is well below the officers flying the plane or the officers in the bridge ordering the planes to be launched. But they have these tech sergeants have absolute final word about anything that they see wrong. And they found that, or, you know, basically that became, you know, the lesson. Every organization needs to have all 3 of these ways of structuring itself. What to do in emergencies. I tell my students, you know, if there's a abuse of a minor child in your parish, this is not a matter for the chain of command. That's a 911 call. That's an emergency protocol. The chain of command has nothing to do with it. You know, there's just nothing. So all kinds of situations in life that are like that, you know, where the emergency protocol sets in. So you need all 3. So what does liturgy do? I mean, liturgy structures that emergency protocol. Liturgy structures the reaction, the interactions in the chain of command, but it's a little bit looser. It has to be a little bit looser in the rule of the tech sergeants. They have to be people who are the ones who can interrupt a ritual, you know, if it's going off the rails. So there is that conversation. the most purely ritualistic thing there is the disaster protocol. This ship would sink without that. And that's the most highly routinized, ritualized, and it's sacred. You're doing it, or we all die. So I don't know. It's just, with just growing up, is knowing that, hey, these are the three classes of order. Every organization needs them. No one teaches this. I don't think any school teaches this. I don't think any business school teaches this. But this is reality.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, actually. And I certainly, I never heard of it, but you didn't mention that in the book, Ted, did you?
Maybe in chapter 7, I don't remember. Because what it is those three modes of order are basically the tripartite society of Plato, of all the ancients. Because, the disaster protocol is really the priests, and the chain of command is the warriors, and then the rule of the tech sergeants is the merchants. And civilization is an equipoise of those three things, Unless you're a Marxist, then you think that the warriors and the priests are just a fake nonsense, and all that matters is economics, is that merchant pole. But that is not civilization. That is just that's a boyhood fantasy of Karl Marx that he never outgrew. Yeah, I just want to offend as many people as possible who might be still trapped in that. But yeah, what he's specifically doing is he's thumbing his nose at the old tripartite structure, saying only one of the three poles matters. And I think this is manifestly not the case.
Yeah, for sure. And another thing that I wanted to bring up is one of the reasons also when I started by talking about Greek culture and kind of like your personal experience with it, like to me that's a little bit close to my heart because I first of all I do like learning a lot about other cultures and kind of like things that are different for me because I feel like that's where a lot of the learning happens. So I'm originally from Portugal, even though I live in Slovenia. So anything east to me is kind of like very, 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 very novel. And so I'm fascinated by everything about it, and I feel like I learn a lot. And so every time that you mentioned like kind of these cultural differences to me, then kind of like my eyes really pop open. And another distinction that you make between these kind of like West versus East and kind of these differences in culture, although in this case it's a lot more theological, but still there's kind of like this different notions of the root of sin that I found very interesting. And I don't think I've ever heard that before. Your book, I think, which is kind of like one of them kind of being very focused on the will, and kind of the other approach being a little bit more on the passions, I suppose, is one way to put it. And I found that very interesting as well because I was just thinking before this podcast, which is like I do find the aspect of asceticism in Orthodoxy like very, very appealing. And it was just occurring to me that when I was younger, I was very much into fitness. Like that was basically my whole life and career and everything. And now that I was thinking about it, I think that's kind of why I gravitated towards it, is because I felt that, the fitness lifestyle has to some degree this level of asceticism. And I suppose that's kind of the only thing that I found within the culture that I had available of kind of like moving in this direction where I can feel myself becoming more real by this aspect of obedience and discipline, and it's just like trying to strip myself in a way. And so I felt like it was kind of like pointing me in this direction because I had nothing else available. When you talked about this distinction in culture, like to me that was quite interesting and made me think. So I would love for you to like unpack this a little bit about kind of like how this developed theologically. Why do you think it happened? And then, how does that translate to the thesis you're trying to present in the book?
Well, I think asceticism is a concomitant of Eros. So if you have a high place for Eros in your culture or in your worldview or your theological system, then asceticism follows on. So, I mean, just think of, I don't know if love songs do this now, but traditional love songs, how much yearning and pining goes into, that contemplation of the person that you haven't yet connected with or has left you, and in the midst of that yearning, you can't eat and you can't sleep and you can't, so there is a very natural preparation within Eros of the self, and a kind of shutting down of everything except you focus on that person. So that comes into theology, obviously, and St. Paul said it. I wish you could all be like me and not be married, but that's not for everyone. But for everyone is some kind of everyone needs to cultivate divine Eros. That's step one, and to do that, we contemplate the divine beauty, and when we do so, other things just fall away. At the same token, if we're starting Lent, we're in the first 3 days of Lent now in the Greek church, and when I was in the monastery one year, the first 3 days the monks eat nothing. So from like Sunday night at like 6 p.m. and then all day on Monday and Tuesday, all they eat is a little bit of holy water and a little bit of blessed bread in the morning. And then on the third day, there's a liturgy, they receive communion, and then there's a light meal around like 10, 11 a.m. or something. And maybe a little later, I don't know. But if you go through fasting like that, you feel progressively a falling away of desire. Like things get simpler. And even the desire for food really starts to lessen. And you start to feel like, I could do this forever, right? It's a kind of euphoria. You got to be careful with that. So I think it comes from both directions. And I think athletes, you're right, are really good examples because they start with they're enraptured by some vision of what they could be and, what they might look like or what they might achieve, what they might win. And then they progressively let go anything that isn't essential for that. And that's a beautiful process. It's an admirable process, and it's, we all have to learn from that. But I think people want God to show up, with zero preparation and with zero effort. And what we want to do instead is have, is to kind of train ourselves for that encounter.
Yeah, and I found kind of like your connection with love to kind of like explain the eras and kind of like how everything else seems to diminish. That is absolutely beautiful, and I never thought about that before, and that makes perfect sense. And when you mentioned the fitness thing of like everything falling away, although that's also something that in my own life that I found dangerous about fitness, actually, which is like it's actually very overpowering of like, this is the only thing that I care about. Like I want to be able to do this, accomplish this, look like this, something like that. And at some point I was like, this is just not healthy, like in the least, right? So it's kind of like, it is good, has kind of like the obviously basic health and basic quality of life and whatnot, but at some point you always have to remember of like what's behind it. Like what is the ultimate goal that you're trying to kind of like orient your life around. And this notion of kind of like seeing what's behind is something that also came up to me quite often while reading your book in regards to beauty, which is kind of these transcendentals were very important to me in my own religious journey. Like that's, I mean, I'm still not like the most traditional, Christian ever, but by any front. So like even now, there's a lot that can be left desired, let's say. But especially in the beginning, at least, that was more or less how I thought about God. Like that was the only thing that made even the concept of God remotely intelligible. It's kind of like whatever is good and true and beautiful, like that is God to me. I'm gonna try to pursue that. And so this was always very important to me. And then beauty in particular also played a really big role for me. For example, it's kind of funny when I say that. It kind of sounds stupid, but if Hildegard didn't exist, for example, like my life would be completely different, like by miles, and I would have never come into Christianity at all. And now that I'm kind of like inside Christianity to some degree, I still, value it by quite a lot. And when I was reading your book, I kept having this thinking about this notion of this obviously goes back to Plato, but in the sense of like the beauty being kind of the radiance of the goods. And you also talk in the book about kind of this notion of whatever is beautiful is kind of like what is Christ, basically. Or a lot of times you put like Christ crucified. And one of the problems with beauty that I find in my own life is kind of like to be careful to not be seduced by false beauty. So it's kind of like to see if the beauty is actually reflecting the goods that I'm trying to chase. And kind of like putting that standard as Christ to me makes perfect sense, like intellectually. But then I struggle really hard in my own personal life when I try to bring that abstraction down to everyday life. Okay, it's like the beautiful is Christ, let's say, in the most simplest way possible. But like, how can you see that in the mundane things of everyday life that are not, about theology, right? That are just like your normal interactions day to day. How do you see that kind of connection occur?
Christ says to the disciples in I don't know if it's John 13 or John 16, I get it mixed up. But he says in the Gospel of John that the Holy Spirit's going to come and he's going to guide you into all truth. He basically he knows everything because he says nothing of himself. He only says what he hears the Father, what the Father wills him to say. So there's the third person of the Holy Trinity, and we're looking for discernment. So is the Holy Spirit. He's God. So I think that this longing, Saint Gregory of Nyssa said, "He who continually searches for God has found him." And because this is a relationship of he's given and we're receiving. He's pouring everything out, and we're making room for that. And so to apply everything on a moment to moment basis is not always going to be obvious. So that's why you structure your life with certain moments that are a little more obvious, like let's say your weekly church attendance, or whatever your daily prayer is, or scripture reading, or whatever. So you have certain moments, and then the rest you just kind of know through experience a lot. You just make mistakes. Some mistakes you just aren't going to make twice, though. You get fooled once. Professors, we get fooled when someone, says, they're going to donate major money. Like, really? You want to believe it. So because the school needs that foundation. But I will say, that Eros is meant to unfold into Agape. It's so Eros for the divine is meant to unfold into this empathy for creation. And that's true in a relationship. You start with Eros for that other person, or you feel it at times at least. But that has to be translated into a tender care and concern for that person, right? This is not, our Eros should not be so fiery and all-consuming that we destroy the people we love and wear them out. So while we privilege Eros, I think we should privilege it. I think it is the best place to begin. It's meant to unfold, not to be just left behind, but to unfold into something, tamer in a way, or in which we allow ourselves to be tamed, while still remaining wild inside.
Yeah, beautiful. That's really well put. And I've mentioned how I do navigate a lot of this liminal space between kind of like the religious worldview and kind of like secularism, in order to kind of try to bridge that. Oh, bridge is the wrong word, but at least make people one side bridge to the other. And one of the things that occurred to me while I was reading your book, especially kind of when you talked about Jane Jacobs, you've mentioned how obviously she wasn't Orthodox, she wasn't religious in any way, but she did have this like very rich worldview, right? So it's just like she understood the importance of beauty, she understood the importance of love, and so on. And a question that I was dying to ask you as I was reading the book and those sections in particular was obviously there's the type of secular / atheist people that are like completely nihilistic and that they're very they just have a very poor worldview. But that's not the example of Jane Jacobs, and that's not the example of a lot of other people, right? So like they have a very fairly rich worldview that I would say almost religious in nature, but they just kind of don't go all the way there. So my question is, for that type of people in specific, like what do you think they are missing in order to do that final jump?
Well, first let me say that I think Jane Jacobs delighted in pattern, and she delighted in life. I don't think though that when she looked at cities, she wasn't most excited about a gorgeous tableau or the perfect building. So she wasn't beauty first in that sense, but she was beauty first in this other sense of she was interested in about what was really there. And she wasn't so truth thirsty that she had an ideology she was going to impose on the world. She was curious about the world and delighted in the patterns she discovered there. And what made her scientific is that, she when she found patterns, and she says this very explicitly, she would try to disprove them. She didn't try to just fall into, the mirage of, of a solution. So only if she couldn't disprove it, did she start to rely on the fact that it's probably true. So it goes back to what you said about, she was gaining discernment over time about what to trust in terms of, what looks good. What is someone like that missing? I guess, in other words, what would they have to encounter to take that other step to a more formal, a more explicit and conscious embrace of what I think of as the source of the values that she holds? I never asked her that question. I did ask her once, why did you, were you ever religious? And she said, I grew up in a, particular faith tradition that was centered around long pedestrian sermons that were heavy on moralism. And she decided that it was really just a system to keep people good in the interest of public order. And she thought she could be good without that. So yes, so I would say for me, I'm like you. Like you're thinking about Hildegard. I mean, Saint Seraphim of Sarov existed. This, pretty much, yeah. Alfred Thayer Mann was asked about anti-Semitism. What was his view on the Jews? And he said, the fact that Christ and his mother were Jews, settles the issue for me. There's no further discussion. So I think for me, like when I knew Elder Ephraim of Arizona, I knew Bishop Yerasimos here of the campus, I knew Father Nicholas Pecatoris in Washington, D.C., I knew Metropolitan Maximus in Pittsburgh. I knew, those are all men, and there's some women too, but I knew people who were saints. You can't talk me out of that. Right. And at the same time, it does pull me forward. Like that was the reality. When I was 22, I went to meet Saint Sophrony, Sakharov, Saint Sophrony of Essex, for the first time. I mean, he was, 90 something. Christianity as an ideology fighting other ideologies has a certain utility. Like apologetics of that kind has a certain utility, and I think it answers real questions people have, and that's great. But I think for a lot of people, it really will come down to, have they met a saint or not? And then I think that after that comes some kind of inner prompting, like the Rilke poem, "You must change your life." Like, you encounter beauty in a holy person in such a way, and I'm not escaping this. This is other people might. Other people are still free, but I'm trapped now. I'm in the net. This is reality. It has called my name. This is where we're going.
Yeah. I never had the pleasure of meeting a saint or anyone like that, but something that to me was personally very, very convincing was more that, you mentioned apologetics. I actually think apologetics aren't very helpful, to be honest. Like I was very interested in apologetics on the other side. Like I'll try to debate religious people, and I thought they were all stupid. I was very stupid back then, of course.
Well, I'm sure some of them were too. I mean, there's plenty of stupidity to go around. I've got a major helping of it myself. So
Right. But I was involved with it for like almost 10 years, maybe. I don't think I ever met a single person that like converted in any sense because of any like, formal arguments of that kind. But so I think its utility is rather limited. But when you mention saints, I do think that's where it's at. I think there's two components to it. One is like, actually meeting people that are practicing the faith and like seeing how connected that is to like to how they are as a person. Like their morality and their goodness is intrinsically linked to like their whole belief system and belief, not just like propositional, but like their whole way of being. And I think that is quite powerful. And then the other thing that also affected me a fair bit of moving towards Christianity was that if you just wear the Christianity goggles, you just see better, basically. Like it's a better description of the human experience. And where you mentioned this kind of sainthood, something that to me affected me a lot when I was reading your book. Like it was probably one of the things that affected me the most. Like when you were describing kind of the limitations of the truth first approach and whatnot in relationship to therapy. You also mentioned kind of like this approach that some priests and some monks have of just kind of like just sitting and listening to you and kind of like absorbing kind of like your suffering to some degree. And to me, when I was reading that, I was like, holy crap, this is one of the deepest things I've I ever read in my entire life. Like it shook me like so deeply. And it also made me think that, when I was younger, at some point I was very interested in psychedelics, which you're probably not a big fan of, which is fine. But and I had kind of like a psychology background, and back then there was kind of the whole renaissance of psychedelic research, and so I was like, okay, I like psychology, I like psychiatry, I like kind of like trying to help mental illness, and also I find psychedelics really interesting. And there was back then this huge push and wave towards training psychedelic therapists because it's been needed if psychedelics eventually would become mainstream, which now they're kind of on their way. And so I thought, okay, maybe that's can be something I do. Like that was kind of my thought back then. I was kind of like figuring out what to do with my life. The thing that didn't push me to actually pursue that, though, is that I just realized how, in order to be a therapist, you really need to have precisely this quality that that I was talking about, that you mentioned in the book, of just this insane amount of presence, that and presence in the sense of like actually being with the suffering of the other person. And that requires to some degree a lot of empathy, although empathy, I don't think it's exactly the right word, but it's the closest that I can come up with. And I remember back then when I was trying to make this decision of like, that's not me, unfortunately. Like I really wish I was that type of person. I try to be as much as I can every day, but I'm not. And so I wouldn't be a good therapist. But this type of thinking and this type of realization, in my opinion, is precisely what sheds light into the truth or the value of Christianity, which is like, to me, it feels almost impossible to deny when you think about it in these terms that this isn't the peak of what being a human, like of being a proper human being is like, right? It's just like there's just the depth that cannot be argued with. And that was just like Yeah, that just completely shook me away when I was reading your book, especially when I was kind of doing this type of introspection about my decisions when I was younger. Something that I wanted to ask was just like, how do you see the role of faith in allowing that type of person to, unfold over time? Because even though I, even though I'm very on board with everything, like I just described, a problem that I always encounter is that it, I try not to be blinded by it, but I also don't, I also feel a little bit uneasy when I'm too much exclusive of a particular tradition. So it's like, even though all of this that I described, for example, the monk or the priest that you described, that just kind of like soaks in all your suffering, um, like surely that's accessible to some degree outside the faith, or like, or do you, do you kind of like want to claim that to some degree?
Oh wow, I mean that's a good point. Um, I think that what we mentioned about nuclear reactors, that because the power is so great, another way to say the potential for chaos is so great, you have to really double down on rituals. And I think this is, at least psychotherapy in the United States does that to a degree. Like, because a person, the therapist, I mean, is encountering so much suffering, they come up with their own rituals. Like, they know when, that on a weekly basis, they're going to check in with their therapist, or the encounter is very ritualized, right? It's these 50 minutes, and it doesn't go, and even if the person is, weeping, whatever, there's an off ramp there. In fact, this can be off-putting about therapists because they can become highly ritualized in how they handle every human encounter, right? Like, you just say good morning, and they start going into the mode, and you know asking you the kind of questions as if you were in therapy with them. Or if you're a friend and then you actually do have something to talk about, again, they just go into that stylized, ritualized mode. um, and this is a defensive reaction. It is, it's a guard against ultimate chaos. It is that second source of order, the spill, the fire. But clearly, it's not how most human beings have conducted intimate relationships for most of human history. They just haven't. This is something new under the sun, or at least, relatively rare. I think what a priest does, is that they have the sense that, there's someone behind them, there's someone within them, there's a power greater than them, and that they don't have to engage emotionally with an empathy. So they're not trying to be like, oh, I wish I could be more empathetic, because it's not an emotion of empathy or a feeling, because that would be too much. That would just get them. They would drown in those difficulties. But they don't have to be analytical and cold like an analyst. They're not there to figure things out. They have a sense there is a higher power within them or behind them, however you think of it, and they're letting those things pass, right straight to Christ. Yeah, I think the empathy game, burn you out if you think of empathy not as the action, but as the emotion, right? Like, you can only see so many tear-jerking movies, right, and get into them in a row. So, yeah, can you do it outside the tradition? I mean, I think it's just important to say that people have done it outside the religious tradition. Some people just have that gift. You know, my grandmother just, she would get dreams and know what was happening. But she was never a particularly religious person in any sense, maybe towards the end of her life. I don't think she was a person who said her daily prayers or anything like that. But, she was in New York or New Jersey. If someone died in the old country, she knew it. She would just wake up and say, I saw so and so, and that was, and they were right. She was right. So I think, there's people have certain gifts. I think Jane Jacobs really had something. There was, in addition to being, I think one of the most important, social theorists of the 20th century, or of history, to be honest. Um, she also, when I compare the experience of being in her presence, for me, someone who's trained by like being near what we call elders in Orthodoxy, abbesses or abbots, and these people with, yeah, she was in that realm. But I don't think other people would have noticed that. I think if her kids heard me say that, they'd probably, or grandkids, think, who's that idiot? What does he know about our grandma? But from someone who studied that, yeah, she had something. There was something there. She was not, you know, I don't know why, but it doesn't really matter. The issue is not, we're not trying to come up with the plan for planet Earth. We have this many years on it. And if we think, if we found faith, then we just have to go in. The other people will take care of themselves. Don't think you're hurting them. It's like saying, you're not gonna marry your fiance because, you're worried about all the men and women who haven't found someone yet. Some of them don't want to find anyone, and some of them have someone you don't know about, and some of them are about to find someone, and just one way or another, no one's asking you to create the ultimate system. You're trying to live existentially to some degree, your life. I'm not saying to you, I'm just saying, you know what I mean? I'm just saying we as human beings don't have to delay living while we work out every last detail.
Now, one of the things that I think about a lot and that I try to learn and articulate as best as I can is kind of like the reality of what I typically like to call the sacred. And a lot of my own work and life kind of revolves around that. And one of the ways that I've been thinking about that the most is within, again, the context of psychedelic therapy, but it's not super specific to that. But in the sense that one of the things that I found so helpful about psychedelics is precisely that I feel like within the mystical experience that there's this element of touching something that people perceive as ultimately real, that they're not willing to negotiate after, right? Because someone can say, oh, this was just like an odd experience that you have, this particular brain chemistry or whatever. But then people are like, no, that was real. I don't care what you say to me. And that's that, right? And then the issue is these types of experiences also allow this like this leap that doesn't seem possible otherwise. It reminds me a lot of like Kierkegaard's leap of faith, where it's kind of like you just have to make a jump that you're actually not rationally allowed to make. And I think this is very analogous to the types of experiences because there's this sense where, if someone is struggling with like trauma or addiction or depression or something, and then they have one of these experiences and they're healing, and then you ask them, how did you manage to turn your life around? Like, as they struggle to articulate, even though it's kind of ineffable, not the experience itself, but like what the experience unfolded of their healing, they might say something like, oh, I just have this sense and this realization that I'm not bound by my past, for example, right? But and that makes perfect sense. Everyone can understand that. But at the same time, it's like, didn't they know that before? Like, everyone knows that. Like, it's almost like a cliche thing, right? But because it's not the proposition thing. It's just like there was just a jump in like identity that they were able to make that they weren't able to do before. And I think what allows that is this touch of the sacred. And I've always wanted to write a paper on this, of kind of like the connection of like the mystical experience and like Kierkegaard's leap of faith, but I never had it very articulated, so I never bothered. But it's always on my mind. And I was reading your book, like this connection came on my mind a lot. Like, obviously you don't speak about this type of stuff necessarily, but the way that you speak about beauty, it does feel like this jump that I'm talking about, which is kind of like when you perceive it, it kind of like allows you to like make a little bit of this jump that isn't rationally justified. And then by doing that, then it allows transformation. And also I think it's very relevant to how you frame beauty against truth first, because again, it's very similar to the parallel within this kind of like psychedelic healing type context. It's just like, you know, these people that were healing that they couldn't heal before, like you couldn't talk them into healing. Like that's just not how it works. Like no matter how hard you tried, right? And again, if you go to Kierkegaard's, it's the same thing, right? Like he doesn't say, oh, you just have to bridge enough in between steps towards the goal that you want to have. Like he says exactly the opposite. The fact that you have to make that jump and you can like articulate your way through it. So this is a very vague question, but because I've been struggling with this so much, and because I kind of saw some hints of it in your work, I'm just curious, kind of like, what do you think of this, of kind of this notion of the leap in regards to the sacred and in regards to how you approach beauty?
I mean, maybe just there are so many realms where where this is routine. Like a person who hasn't tried drugs, but marijuana, ecstasy, LSD, whatever, they haven't tried it. And then the person who has it, they've crossed a line. There's some experience that they can speak of from within it. And to try to describe it to someone else or to encourage someone else to cross that line, right? Okay, that would take kind of a leap of faith. I trust you. Everything's going to be okay if I do this. That's a kind of leap of faith. But you know very much that you're in a different place after you cross that line. Like a person who's crossed that line is in a different place. And that is, we just know that, right? And it's somewhat similar with the experience of coming into the church, I think, that at a certain point, are you in or are you out? And if you're in, then you will know from the inside. And it's never can really be translated to the person. But it's the same with, with the marital relations, right? A person who is outside, and you see this more clearly when these transitions of drugs or sex happen to a young person, right? Because it's very clear to them that they know something now they didn't know, but that they couldn't really describe or couldn't really say, it couldn't really translate to their old self. They just have crossed, it's an initiation that so I think we have experiences like this all the time. And to say that in this realm alone, in theology, that I'm never going to cross that line because somebody convinced me intellectually that it's not possible to cross that line, it just seems a little suspect. I mean, it's fake. We don't want to cross it because we know it's true. And of course, in my book I write about trauma as well, and it's the same with killing. The person who's killed has crossed a line. That's an initiation. It's a unique, brotherhood that even most people in the military, like say in the United States military that's been fighting wars, will never cross. I mean, the kind of the Orthodox Christian hesitance about the Roman Catholic Church is that at some point, what was the 13th century or whenever it was, that the initiated gave way to the university people, that the university people controlled theology. They're just talking about it. They're not doing it. And so that is an example of truth first, suddenly having more currency than beauty first. So of course, I'm not saying that to be critical of the Roman Catholic Church, and there's counter arguments to that, obviously. But this in general, is a thing. Like religion is not primarily owned by a bunch of people in a library, and it's owned by the bishop, and is owned by the bishop because he's a kind of ultimate initiate who carries within himself, as St. Dionysius says in the ecclesiastical hierarchy, the bishop is bishop, but he's still a priest, and he's still a deacon, and he's still a layman, and he's still a catechumen. So he's, on behalf of all of us, he's leading, it's this anagogical thing of this, leading everyone into an initiation. Now you know. I mean, I know this is a highly anxious age, and I feel it too. But there are certain things that you can talk about it forever, you will not come any closer to the truth. You just have to cross that line. Obviously, I'm not saying you should kill someone or I don't think people should do drugs, because I just think it's just rolling the dice, too much with your precious brain. But still, everyone knows that example. Almost everyone in the West has some kind of, they know, what that's like, in your teenage years, whether you cross that line or you don't.
Right. Yeah, 100%. Another aspect that I found very interesting in your book was when you talked about kind of the berserk modes, and kind of like the whole act of berserking. To me, that was quite interesting, and kind of how you framed it has kind of like this inversion of liturgy. And a connection that I'd like your take on is that prompt a couple connections in my mind, and I think they're all related, but I'm not sure how much. I'm just curious what you think of it. So one of them is, mass shootings came to mind, which is like, to me, a little bit, yeah, it just strikes me as not exactly the same thing, because kind of the berserk mode that you initially mentioned was in the context of war, where it's like initially out of a sense of protection, and it just goes haywire. Well, the mass shooting is a bit different, but it still strikes me as a little bit in the same direction, which is kind of like this completely like let go towards rage, and like almost this revenge towards the world, like revenge towards being, towards God, in some sense. And then another thing that came to mind is also that it seems to be a somewhat common trope and pattern as well, in kind of like comic books and anime, Dragon Ball, things like that. Because you see this a lot, but it's kind of like often, kind of like a good guy fighting a bad guy, and they're like they can't win for whatever reason, they're not strong enough, and then usually they kind of like snap in some way that finally allows them to overcome it. But it's a snapping that's not wholly good, that it's kind of like they lose their sense of themselves and their surroundings and their humanity, let's say. And so it's also very dark. And so that does feel exactly like the berserk mode in some way. And also, another aspect that I found interesting is because I've thought about this, like these patterns in fiction for quite a while, especially in this context of the kind of cartoons and superheroes and things like that, which is also, if you like a lot of young people, like especially teenage men, things like that, there's also like a sort of longing as well for that state, which is kind of like, which is like, to some degree, I think it's partially a secularized version of theosis showing itself by the act of self-sacrifice. I think that's part of like what drives the ambition. But the fact that there's dark as well, it's not only that. There's an element of this berserk element, which is just like you kind of snap, and then nothing else matters except the expression of rage, basically. And so I'm just wondering if you see those connections, or if you think there's something fundamentally different about the berserk mode that you speak of.
I don't know the comic book examples well. Certainly when we hand ourselves over to berserk mode, it's what we're aiming for is a total weaponization of the self and the interest of survival or vengeance, or to prevail in this encounter. Jonathan Shay, who's the big inspiration for my work, who wrote Achilles in Vietnam and about combat trauma, he says, if you cross that line, there's really no going back. So it does have this, it has this, I mean, you may return to quote unquote normal, but you're altered in some way. I think maybe in religion, that can be reversed, but I don't see it. So I think we just have to, I think if we're interested in combat or something, if we think we want to fight for what's right, I think we have to learn from the best warriors, and they do not berserk, and they don't want berserkers in their units. They just don't. They're unsafe, and they're a danger to everyone, including the enemy, but also their allies. And that's not civilization, right? That it is a kind of, it's kind of a dark occult. An occult act. And occasionally, yeah, this happens. Sometimes, a person can seem to be berserking. They just, just to protect their child, they really puff up with, rage and apparent rage. And, but if they haven't taken anyone's life, then I think it's easier to, I think recovery is possible more easily. But I like what you said. I think that's inspiring to think that young people have this desire for a kind of either theosis or apotheosis, that somehow, that some kind of fulfillment through self-offering. And I think, wasn't it Margaret Mead said, that every culture has a rite of passage for their young men to become men, except ours. And I think that they're creating their own. Nowadays, in my day, in my adult life, we criticize someone who lacks virtue. But other cultures, Asian cultures, other cultures, Christian cultures, they would have taken you by the hand and say, and here's the process by which you can acquire those virtues. And that's, so we do need to put these structures, these rituals back in place.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I do think specifically what you mentioned about kind of these initiations / rituals, I do think that's pretty important as well. Because I do feel like and I'm particularly fascinated by this story by this pattern of superheroes and anime and things like that, because like I see it so clearly of like completely secular people that think religion is like completely stupid, and then they're watching these like super religious patterns and like longing for it so much in their heart, and I'm like, you don't even understand what you're watching. And it's like, well, or maybe that's the problem. Like you understand it too much, but you just understand it so deeply that you don't realize it because it's so intuitive to you.
Well, look at Christianity. I mean, it's the bridegroom, gets tangled with the enemy, drops into hell, defeats the enemy, and comes out and marries the bride. I mean, that's the structure of the Christian story. That's really every James Bond movie. I mean, but a sort of more secular version of that. But he's often dropping into somehow with the arch enemy, and pops up later, with the bride. And until Daniel Craig just got tired of doing them and said, "Just kill me." Now they gotta think how they're gonna write the next ones. That's a problem. I mean, they should just pretend it didn't happen. Yeah, it's an endlessly engaging. Like if you add up the box office of all James Bond movies combined, right? I mean, it's so vast. And it just, if every movie that is the hero tangles with, the villain into the abyss, kills him and emerges, what percentage of cinema is that? 20%, 25%, 15%? It's a huge chunk. That's a story that never gets old. That is, what C.S. Lewis called the Corn King. The superhero, like you're saying, it never ends. And you don't really have any alternatives. The purpose of a man's life is to kill a bad man and marry a good woman. I read that somewhere, and it's, there's some truth to that.
Yeah, for sure. Another thing that surprised me a little bit when I was reading your book is that you first started out with trauma, and you kind of unfold the whole argument. And first of all, one of the things that I found odd is that you focus very much on talk therapy. First of all, I would like to ask why that is, because like to me, coming from like a psychology background, like talk therapy like is a thing, but it's not like the main thing. The main thing is like CBT, but like that's the standard therapy in modernity. Let's call it. Modernity is not the right term, but contemporary psychology / psychiatry, let's say. And you only mentioned CBT like 300 pages in. And I'm just wondering, like, why did you decide to take that as, just kind of like the model of therapy to argue against?
Well, can you explain to me, I mean, what is CBT? I mean, what's going on there? Like, how would they handle a traumatized person, in other words?
Right. So I'm not 100% sure how it works in trauma in specific.
Or just anything, because
Yeah. So like in anything, like uh, CBT is very easy to understand if you know Stoicism, because that's where it came from. So it's mostly like focusing on what's on your what you can control, basically. I would say almost everything derives from that, but also another way of understanding its more practical application as well is that you don't want to feed these like destructive loops of thought that you have. And so, which is, I think you actually mentioned that. I think you described at some point CBT, and it's in the correct direction, right? So, and that actually feeds into my next question that I was going to ask right after about CBT, which is like, because you talk about talk therapy, which is not as accepted and as mainstream, at least for like normal therapy. Maybe for trauma, I'm not very familiar with trauma, so maybe I'm wrong on the specific application. But one of the things that came to mind when you then switched to CBT is that you framed it as, kind of like an alternative or the antithesis, at least within this kind of like uh, institutional therapy context of the truth first approach, right? So it's kind of like, so the way that you framed it, correct me if I'm wrong, is that in CBT, you're not trying to dissect, whatever happened in your past, right? So you're only like trying to, kind of focus on what you can do and kind of like move past it and focus on, adaptive things that are healthy, and not like this whole deconstruction and archaeology. And I get all of that, but my question is, because then this has a direct analogy towards your whole approach. So I'm just curious how you think about it, which is, even though CBT has decent empirical support, there's a lot of criticism of it, and by a million reasons. Some psychological, some philosophical, some theological. But one of the most common criticisms is that it's a bit dismissive, which is just like, okay, sure, it helps because you're not feeding this like these negative self-reinforcing patterns of thought and of behavior, and so you're trying to get away from that. But at the same time, that's also dismissing it in a way, and especially in the context of CBT, especially kind of like the more like critical theory oriented people, they rightly say, at least partially rightly, they mention how that's almost dehumanizing to some degree, because especially in the context of why most people are in therapy in begin with, which is just like, okay, you're depressed, okay, but maybe the reason why you're depressed, and a lot of times it is the case, but not always, is maybe because your life is just complete crap, because maybe you're super poor, you're working 2 jobs, like you can't, like you're always with anxiety if you can like pay your children's foods for the upcoming week, right? And then you go to CBT, and it's like, sure, it works, but it works by saying, oh, don't focus on all these negative thoughts, just focus on what you can control. And there's that, and it might work in practice, but what you're doing is basically treating this human as this unit of just like, we need to tinker, we need to adjust it just so that they can be productive, right? Because like, okay, you're dysfunctional, okay, just don't think about it, think about other stuff, just so that you're not depressed anymore. Now go back to work, right? So this is kind of the line of argument. I'm just curious how you see that, because obviously then this has a parallel to kind of like your overall thesis within the realm of trauma.
I mean, when I talk about this now, I mean, this is 12 years after having really written the book. I think of the progression to human wholeness as a concentric circle of animal, human, person. That, dealing with the person as an animal, like getting them out of the dangerous situation, meeting basic needs, some basic self-regulation, the right, the right relational support, good patterns of self-care. I mean, I think that, many guys coming back from really intense combat deployments do this on their own. They self-medicate through drugs or alcohol, but they're trying to restabilize the nervous system. Um, and then this has to unfold in the practice of empathy towards others and of care for others. I think that these are essential components of the process and have to be given, full due. And then, at the personal level, obviously, your past can come up at any time and needs to be addressed in some way when it does. Um, I think at the personal level, in the context of good patterns of self-care and, strengthening relational bonds, I think it's makes more sense to me to do some of that archaeological work. I would just be worried that starting it too early, in a very analytical way, is increasing the person's awareness of the hell that they're in before the journey out has begun. So I think of it as this concentric unfolding. It seems to me like ethics as a program for soul therapy is telling you that that the practice of virtue is always going to be part of the solution. Like, except when you're really destabilized by a trauma flashback, you don't really normally just get to be a child again, that someone just holds you. That normally you have to give something, take some tiny step. And I think that's the way ethics can be a complement or a reminder to therapy, that, of responsibility and growing virtue. But for Christianity, I think, there's something more, which is this possibility of an ontological union with God and deification and the sacramental connection to the sacred at every stage of this process. Ultimately, as handsome is as handsome does. Like, whatever a severely traumatized or depressed person, whatever works, let's do more of that. I don't think that theory can control. But what I'm talking about in the book is where theory controls so much and is pushing you in a way, in this other mode, that awareness of yourself, self-knowledge, is sufficient. And as I say, to me, this is entirely too Greek. It's completely Platonic, that, no one can willingly do wrong, because no one can knowingly do wrong, because then they will realize that they're only harming themselves. People harm themselves all the freaking time. It's the story of our day, of our age, of every age. And I think, St. Paul's saying, the very good I would do, that I do not do, makes, has to be in there together with whatever is a more philosophical approach to the soul. We do need this sense that we do need God. But if someone isn't religious at all, and if the therapist isn't religious, I think you just do the best you can. People have resources we aren't aware of. You cannot get a control. You're not even quite sure what's happening inside that person, even after many hours of conversation. And what memory from childhood, what not memory, what just fact that they were loved at 6 months in a meaningful way is still a resource in there to be called upon when they're ready to start going. So yeah, I'm not trying to be critical of therapists, except to the extent that they've become, dogmatic. I certainly would work with a therapist if I were, let's say, a parish priest or something. But I might also tell a person, you've been going to therapy enough, and, it's getting annoying now. you're not here to become a philosopher, a Stoic philosopher, any other philosopher. You're not a Platonist, and you're not a Stoic. And by the way, I think therapy has changed in the United States from what I understand. That because you follow the money trail, insurance doesn't pay for it anymore. Medical insurance, it pays for a few visits, and something that's more akin to sports psychology seems to be in vogue. Just like, what do you need to get through to make some kind of short-term gain? Yeah, I'm not an expert though, and forgive me if that's not a good answer to the.
No, that helps. The context that definitely helps. But yeah, it's very tricky. Like these things get complicated very fast. But I'm not a trauma expert by any chance. Like I'm decent familiar with like most forms of therapy, but I never looked at trauma very specifically. So I just wanted to get your general thoughts on it, and it was quite interesting.
Yeah, the human soul is complex, and and people are grappling through these things. But I said this to someone, and he said that if you think of animal, human, person, that there are 4 or 5 different schools of of psychology at each level, really, that handle all those things. So psychology is much more complex. In our kind of popular American understanding, the idea has emerged that if you just knew the source of your pain, but grief takes work, and grieving situations and things like that. You know, it takes a specific kind of work, and I think a specific kind of grace.
Yeah, absolutely. I really like the thesis of your book, and one of the reasons, well, there's many reasons, of course, but one of them is because of what I mentioned of that. I saw a lot of parallels about how I think about the sacred. But there was one thing that bothered me quite quite a bit. Bothered me in the sense of like I was struggling with, which is I mentioned before that the transcendentals to me were very important in kind of my own journey. But one of the reasons how I started to make sense of religion was more just focusing on the figure of Christ has just kind of like this archetype of goodness, right? Like that the incarnation was just like, okay, I certainly believe in a more reality because I'm embedded on it, and I'm not going to reject that just because of some, I don't know, intellectual games that I play with myself. So I take that as the most real, and then I can conceptualize degrees of that, which takes me to like a platonic form of goodness, and then it's like what allows me the best understanding of that. And it didn't take me very long to realize that was Christ, basically. And so that's how I thought about it for a long time. But that made it a goods approach first. But then I struggled a little bit with that, which is when I thought about religion in this kind of schema, I had a lot of trouble reconciling that with a lot of other aspects of Christianity, which are more like traditionally about God, where I didn't see how that would fit. Like that belief about Christ, let's say, that can be lived and understood entirely without God, but that's not Christianity really. And so I always struggled. Okay, I have this scheme of the goods, but then how does that connect to all these notions of God as the source of reality and the creator of being and all these things? And it never really made a lot of sense to me, and it's something that I struggled a fair bit. But in the last 1 to 2 years, especially as I started to dig a bit deeper into Neoplatonism, I was really drawn to this idea of just like levels of reality and this like notion of ascension. And only through that is that I started to be able to understand Christianity in a more traditional form, where it's not just like Jesus has this moral person, but about this actual truth that is embedded into reality, and that as I participate in Christianity, I get closer to reality. And to me, that feels like truth. And so I had this very funny episode in my life where, at some point in my prayer, I mentions the transcendentals, and I say the eternal source of goodness, of truth and beauty. Yeah, and that's how I've always said it. And then as I was in this period of like learning about Neoplatonism and thinking this stuff through, it's actually really funny that I caught myself slipping when I was saying that, and I would say it's wrong, where I would put truth first. And there was a few months where I was kind of vacillating between goodness first and truth first. And it just came to me. I wasn't planning. And eventually I just settled on always saying truth first. So I kind of flipped them, kind of like at an instinctual level. But I found, and so the reason why I'm giving all this context is to kind of explain a little bit of my approach of like how I came to see the importance of truth in my schema, and specifically within the order of the transcendentals. And what I think one of the reasons why that worked so well for me is because that allowed me to view the Christian experience and this whole notion of participation, of where the moral aspect of it was intimately connected by how aligned to reality you were. Right. It's kind of like the more I ease my self-deception through, for example, all the asceticism and all the stuff we talked about, right? Then I feel more in touch with reality. And then because reality is inherently good, then I become good, right? Like it's kind of like I get closer to the source, right? And so that made a lot more sense to me. And now, compared to 2 years ago, now that I've adopted this truth first approach, let's say, like I just feel like I can see so much deeper into the tradition, and it just speaks a lot true to me. It's a lot more beautiful. It's a lot more good, right? But the thing is, obviously, what you argue in the book is almost the complete opposite, right? So that was like short circuiting my brain quite a lot, because not only am I always putting beauty last, even though I think it's very important. I mentioned my several examples. So not only do I put beauty last, but also I switched from goodness to truth. While you also argue not only is beauty first, but also, goodness is above truth. So I seem like I get everything wrong. So I'm just curious what you think about it, and help me untangle this.
Well, what I was trying to say, and so maybe in some passages it wasn't crystal clear. What I was said about, I think healing is animal, human, person. It's this concentric unfolding that we have to. That's the path we trace. And I think Christ followed the mirror image, which is why we follow ours. He's the divine person who takes on humanity and then dies like a sacrificial lamb. And I believe in the Eucharist gives his life for the life of the world. I mean, so he's person, human, animal, and we're animal, human, person. That's so we go back up. So I think God is the true God, whose goodness is so great it cannot be contained. It spills over outside himself and shines out as the beautiful. So for him, it's truth, goodness, beauty. And then we're meant to fall in love with that beauty, see practice the good that is behind it, and become true. Or in a very, very practical way, like my advice for people, attending the Divine Liturgy, if they go to Orthros and that's an hour and a half and liturgy's an hour and a half, and you're there for 3 hours, I say, when you come in, first, just catch your breath, just stabilize yourself, regulate your nervous system, and then observe the beauty that's around you, the incense, the icons, the ritual, the the architecture, the people in the icons, all that beauty. And then practice goodness by praying for the other people in the church, and then other people outside the church, and then for the whole world. So having put beauty first and then goodness, now speak to God face to face. So that's my animal, human, person in the liturgy. But it's important to remember this, that in a Neoplatonic system, or I think in a Christian system, that your aesthetic sense, your whether it's your spiritual aesthetics or whatever, is supposed to be a cognitive sense. So some of the beauty first versus truth first thing collapses, it goes away. So that is a cognitive sense, your ability to discern pattern, your ability to discern beauty from ugliness, health from illness. That's intellectual. And I like to say that, if you hold to evolution, then you have to understand, and then you have to accept that for billions of years, living things were processing information and making appropriate responses without a cerebral cortex. They didn't have rational thought. They just had sensation. And on that basis alone, I mean, I'm talking protozoa and, the most basic life forms, animals, up until some kind of animal brain develops, they are cognitively reacting. I mean, they are reacting rationally on the basis of aesthesis, basis of feeling. And all that apparatus is inside you if you believe in evolution. So your approach to truth cannot just be armchair philosopher. It has to be what you experience at a dance and what you experience drinking with your friends and at a party and in church and going to a museum, and you have this tremendous apparatus for cognition about beauty, goodness, and truth just in your aestheses, and that needs to unfold and be recovered. So I think I hear you saying the same thing, that you thought about, when I think about who is God, the source, you're saying we start with truth, goodness, and beauty. I think that is the correct order. I think. And I think, we trace it back. We're the mirror image of that. But these distinctions are helpful. The purpose of the book, in a way, is therapy, right? It's for the ultimate audience for my book, and maybe 500 people have gotten this out of the 8,000 copies that were sold, is really for probably an American soldier, because that's who's coming back from the wars and trying to make sense of what is going on. And one guy said, he said, I came back from the wars, and I just started going to church all the time. And then my priest said, you ought to read The Ethics of Beauty. He said, I was mostly healed just from going to church so much. Then I had a framework, and I was done. There was nothing left of, there was no, it was just done. And I think, that's, so the book really is not really a major chess move in philosophy. I mean, real philosophers like you, probably tear it apart on different aspects, but it's really aimed at that kind of person who needs to get a handle on their trauma in a way that's going to work, practically speaking, through a beauty first approach. Yeah. So.
Yeah, I totally understand that, and yeah, obviously, I understand that a lot of the purpose of the book was precisely this trauma approach, which I think is obviously very insightful.
It's a nice way to do theology or philosophy, to have that kind of very therapeutic aim in mind. Even though, of course, I'm critical of therapy as it's often practiced in the United States today. But I know that that's a field that's in constant flux and evolution and whatnot, and I wish it well.
Yeah, the reason why I brought this up, even though I know that the original context was more trauma, was just because, again, for my own work, because I'm very interested in kind of like these interactions of the transcendentals and this notion of kind of like what draws you in towards kind of like the whole aspect of transformation. So this book is very relevant for me. So the reason why I was trying to unpack some of this and give a bit of personal context is more so that to try to, in case my schema needs updating, to update it as best I can, because then when I spread it around, to be as helpful as it can.
Can I address this other issue, though, of the, are we worshiping the God of the philosophers, or are we worshiping this person, or who's our relationship with, or where's our salvation, where's our hope? And I think, for me, it's Christ specific in particular who spills over outside himself and shines out to non-being as the beautiful and draws it into existence through the power of attraction. And then with the incarnation, we see that in time. And to me, to put beauty first is to fall in love with Christ and him crucified. And to practice goodness is to be willing to be crucified with him for the life of the world. And that's a high definition of goodness, but I think it really is the highest, and one we've got to reach if we're going to have a civilization. Lots of people have to do that. Lots of people, like everyone, moms, dads, brothers, sisters, small town mayors, big city mayors, prime ministers, they have to be willing to be crucified for the life of the world. That's the level of goodness that it takes to have a civilization, I think, worth having. And that is the kind of civilization that can be stable, that can be true in this other sense of true, like actually be maintained, actually exists in time. I don't think any other civilization can. It'll just be constant warfare and always, lurching from crisis to crisis.
Right. Yeah, that was absolutely beautiful, and completely agree as well. Just as a last quick question, obviously, beauty is the whole north star of the book, and as I mentioned, a lot of what I do is trying to reach a little bit of the secular world. So putting those two things together, what would you say is kind of like a very practical, straightforward, secular way that people can get in touch with ultimate beauty?
For me, beauty is the mild triumph of crucified love. That's how, if I had to define beauty in a sentence, it's the mild triumph of crucified love. And I think that, we want to, when we see that, when we see it, even if the triumph is very mild, right? Like someone said to me yesterday, they said, yeah, we might honor the winner of the marathon more, but the marathon runner who wins, and one of these guys who won in 2 hours and 20 minutes said, yeah, you see those guys still coming in 7 hours later? I suffered for 2.5 hours. They're suffering for 7. So I think the mild triumph of crucified love is everywhere around us if once we look for it. And I think it's is what defines art and defines our, good architecture. I think it's true, in the people who love us and have sacrificed for us. I just think it's just make a habit of admiring that. Um, the danger there, though, is like you said, that you end up making an idol out of, I don't know, some mass murderer who suffered for his, his dictatorship art or something, is the art of, subjugating nations. So I think, just in general, my advice to anyone, believer, not believer, is set aside 30 days. Just, say for the next 30 days, every day, I'm going to ask God for a spiritual awakening. And I'm not going to define ahead of time, or when I'm asking that, I'm going to have an empty mind, just an empty mind about what that spiritual awakening would look like. And I think any person, Christian, non-Christian, believer, not believer, I think it's an experiment they might consider, and just see what happens.
Amazing. That's a fantastic place to end. Everyone highly recommends the book if you enjoyed a lot of the topics here on this episode. There was a lot more that could be covered, and the book is actually quite rich and also quite wide in scope. But yeah, if this was interesting, highly recommend it. And yeah, Timothy, thank you so much for the conversation. It was amazing, and I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thanks for pressing me on some things. I appreciate it, Tiago. Very good. Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
Thank you.